The modern church looks at monastic communities in a negative light. What if I told you that the monastic way of living was not always frowned upon in the church? Now we see a sort of new monasticism on the rise today. Today, we will look at monastic communities, their history, and their relevance for today. All this on the Reformed Catholic Podcast. This is the Reformed Catholic Podcast, and I'm your host, John Michael Samick. In a day and age when we see a culture around us in the United States as almost entirely opposed to teaching of Christianity, and churches that are not following the biblical mandate of being in the world but not of the world, what ought the Christian do to abandon the materialistic mindset of this world and fully commit himself to the Lord Jesus Christ? Many have started meeting for church in their houses to facilitate a more natural and family-focused environment. Still others are seeking to work within liberal churches, liberal Christian denominations, to make them conservative once again. For many others, the answer lies in living in a monastic community where they devote themselves to living closely with other Christians who are likewise ready to forsake the materialistic mindset of this world and devote themselves to reading and studying God's Word, a life of prayer, and loving each other in the radical way that Christ taught us to. It is this new monastic movement which we will focus on today. Ever since the Protestant Reformation, monastic communities have had a bad name in Protestant circles because of the abuses that were practiced by the Church of Rome. But the monastic life was not always seen in a negative light in the history of Christianity. Many of the church fathers, as Augustine, saw living in a monastic community as a way of devoting one's life to the teachings of Christ, and as a way to positively reach and affect the world around them. Almost immediately after being baptized into the Christian faith, Augustine and his son, along with some of their friends, sought to establish a monastic community in Tagaste. Augustine saw communal living as a way to remove oneself from the distractions of this world to focus on Christ, while at the same time learning to love others as Christ taught us to. He writes, "We should not so surrender ourselves to the leisure of contemplation that we forget to help our neighbors, nor should we become so immersed in activity that we lose our longing to contemplate God in recollection." For Augustine, the monastic life was a balance between work and worship, with both being avenues to know and love Christ more. As he states, "Pray as though everything depended on God. Work as though everything depended on you." In the medieval ages, the focus of monastic living continued this balance between prayer, reading the scriptures, and work. Monasteries served as places of education in the community, and monks served as teachers and physicians to the people in their communities. The monastic life was one of balance between spiritual discipline and serving others. In these two tasks, the monk sought to live out the two greatest commandments: to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. But by the time of the Reformation, many monasteries became places of materialism and greed, while also forbidding monks to marry and viewing monastic living as a way to merit salvation. The Protestant reformers overthrew many monasteries for these reasons. But in our modern time, we are seeing a resurgence of Christians who want to live in fellowship with one another in a communal way. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes of a new kind of monastic community which will restore the church. Quote, "The restoration of the church will surely come only from a new type of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old, but a complete lack of compromise in a life lived in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount in the discipleship of Christ. I think it is time to gather people together to do this." End quote. Many Protestant communities have formed in the 20th century by both Lutheran and Anglican denominations alike, which are devoted to the reading of scriptures, prayer, and loving each other, just as the old monasticism, and yet at the same time focusing on returning to living off the land and the more independent style of living. Today, we have with us Joshua Johnson, the founder of the Christian Exodus Project and the Jesus Village community. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Joshua, when you look at the Christian world today, what do you think about the negative stereotype that many have had towards monastic communities and the rise of a new monasticism?
Well, I would say that the negative stereotypes against monasticism originate in the points that you've just outlined, with the abuses that we see in the Roman Church and to a lesser degree even in the Eastern Church. And I think for Protestants specifically, the enforcement of clerical celibacy has always been kind of a hurdle. Now, there are monastic communities, there are convents within, like the Anglican Communion, for instance, and they're really not a whole lot different than historic monasticism, but they've kind of removed the merit and the corruption aspects of it. And so I think that is a step in the right direction. Now, obviously, I think Celtic monasticism, which existed in Ireland and Scotland, in the early centuries of the church, exemplified, I think, a good way of doing it, which is all the aspects of communal life that people are striving for, common ownership, living off the land, all of those sorts of things. But they allowed for couples who were married to be part of that monastic order. Now, when Augustine, not St. Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine, who was the evangelist to the Britons after the fall of Rome, when he went there, and they didn't really expect to see a Christian church there, because when Rome fell, the Celtic peoples were basically separated from Christianity as it continued to develop in Italy and in the Roman Empire. So when the barbarians took over, the assumption was that basically all of the peoples there had been taken over by paganism. But when the missionaries from Rome went there and saw that there was actually Christians still there and still thriving, they were shocked. And one of the things that they were also shocked to see was that an older way of doing Christianity was still in fashion there, including monastic communities where you had married couples present. Another thing with monasticism that I would like to add is regarding its history is that monasticism itself kind of became like a new elite within the church that imposed ideas from above that led to a lot of the corruption that we see later on in the Roman Church in the Middle Ages. As an example, when martyrdom was, I would say, popular in a way, because even though Christians were being martyred under Diocletian and Nero, there was like a heroism that was associated with martyrdom. So a lot of Christians were eager, especially young men, were eager to suffer for their faith, die for their faith, and they actually pursued it very zealously and willingly. But when under Constantine you see the toleration and then eventually establishment of Christianity in the empire, a lot of these people who would have otherwise been martyrs were kind of left in a situation where, what do we do now? And I think the church themselves, the church itself was very much looking for leadership and people to respect and kind of raise up as heroes and examples. And for a long time, it was the martyrs that filled that role. But now that Christianity was tolerated, the temptation was for the church to become increasingly worldly in that time of toleration and establishment. So a lot of Christians turned to monasticism as a way of, being a martyr in a time when Christians were no longer being persecuted. So instead of dying for the faith or being tortured, instead people willingly suffered through cutting themselves off from material possessions, cutting themselves even off from marriage, things of that sort, to say, hey, look, I'm a living martyr even now in the time when we're no longer being persecuted by the state. And though I think the impulse and the motivation was good in a way for doing that, the negative consequences of that were that you had the formation of a group of people that really viewed themselves as like a higher state of Christian because they were in the monasteries. And now, granted, there were improvements in monasticism during this time. So before St. Basil the Great, you had a lot of these monks who lived basically in hermitude, right? They would go out in a cave, they would stand on pillars, they would do all sorts of strange things, go out into the desert. And though some of these men had, good spiritual writings like the Desert Fathers and the Philokalia and things like that, which is still a revered document in the Eastern Church, but very, very helpful. St. Anthony, also highly respected in the Egyptian church, the Coptic church, these men were great men, for what they did, but at the same time, it was very like decentralized. And so St. Basil had monastic reforms where he brought it under the authority of the bishops. But even so, you still continue to see this trend towards asceticism, which I would argue is negatively influenced by like Platonic thought, where there's like this huge dichotomy between the body and the soul. So self-punishment became like in vogue as a way of like, look how righteous I am. And so over time, the monastic system basically became the vetting process for who was going to be a leader in the church. Soon you see, as is still the case in the Eastern Church, only bishops had the requirement of celibacy imposed upon them. And so all bishops were drawn from the monastic background, whereas the local minister or priest would be married. And the Roman Church would eventually take it a step further due to the investiture controversy in Latin Europe, where they would eventually make it so that all clergy, more or less, were coming from the monastic system, because no clergy, either the local priest or the bishop, was permitted to have been married. And so there you see kind of like a circling of the wagons and a institutional capture and self-preservation kind of spirit entering monasticism, where you entered, especially if you were from wealthy, like you were a nobleman, you wanted to have influence on the church, you sent a son into the monastery, he became a monk, and eventually he'd be appointed as a bishop or a priest, and that would benefit you maybe as a king or as royalty. And then, of course, later on, as time went on, you see that the monasteries were some of the hotbed of corruption. Just as priests were, taking mistresses in the High Middle Ages, something that the reformers were fighting against.
So that's where the corruption started to set in.
Yeah.
With men desiring their sons to have that influence.
Well, of course, yeah, there was definitely worldly power there, but I would say that the monastic system itself was corrupt, even without that external influence of the royal family sending their sons into the monasteries, because there was a self-preservation mechanism starting to form, where it was like a boys' club, right? Like, oh, I'm going to ordain you because, hey, we were in the same order, right? We were in the Franciscan order together, right? So I'm going to, we're going to grease some palms. I'll make sure that you get ordained, and the church's motivation was like, well, these people were theologically trained. We know that there was like a vetting process, but that vetting was part of like perpetuating this monastic doctrine of superiority, that basically, hey, because we were monks, because we were part of a monastic order and submitted to such an order, we alone are qualified for ordination, and only men who've gone through that system can be ordained. And that's what led to a lot of the corruption and the perpetuating of clerical celibacy. And I would say the last thing I would add on that is that as we go into the later centuries in the Roman Church specifically, Rod Dreher brought this up and wrote an article on this, I believe, for the American Conservative, about the Lavender Mafia. So Rod Dreher was in the Roman Church for some time, and through his journalism exposed something that had been known to have been going on quite some time, which was the child trafficking, pederasty, pedophilia, homosexuality within these celibate clerical circles in the monastic orders of the Roman Church. So a lot of these men were basically sexually degenerate, and it was known within the monastic system, and there was a whole mafia of people, higher ups within the monastic system and among bishops, who were basically perpetuating this conduct. And so part of the bad rap we see today with like the view of monasticism and clerical celibacy, I think is somewhat justified, because obviously a lot of men who aren't attracted to women, it's not that they just want to serve Christ is the reason that they're unattracted to women. They're unattracted to women because they're deviant sodomites. And so by being deviant in that way, they're going to look out for their own, right? And so they aided each other in trafficking children, getting children into monasteries so that they could be groomed into that lifestyle. And so what the reformers saw, because like this is an old problem. Now, Rod Dreher's writing in the 21st century, so obviously it's a problem that continued even further on into our own day. But even in the medieval times, there was issues, right? Whether it was heterosexual hypocrisy, where monks who took vows of celibacy were having mistresses, or it was monks involved in pederasty and homosexual behavior, because the reformers mentioned that as well. So this sort of thing has been going on a long time. And I feel that if we had a more biblical-based monasticism where clerical celibacy was permitted but not enforced, that would be a good check on that. The Eastern Church also doesn't have nearly as many problems with these kind of scandals as the Latin Church eventually would come to have, because they at least had the local ministers be married. That was at least some check on that. I can't speak for the bishops in the Eastern Church whether or not there is a homosexual corruption issue, though there's definitely a monetary corruption issue in the Eastern Church, as we see with the Patriarch of Moscow, being a billionaire and obviously taking very corrupt political stances to favor the host nation, but that's obviously a separate conversation. But the negative view of monasticism really is derived from the abuses that we saw, and they were real abuses, and they're real abuses that originate because the checks and balances that Scripture would impose on Christian men by requiring marriage in certain cases, they were just ignored, and by ignoring them, we allowed that corruption to come in.
Yeah, it's kind of the abuses that you expect to see in a community where you didn't allow men to marry, all men to marry, and so we see some of the same abuses today.
And you mentioned the rise of a new monasticism.
What do you think about, this desire that we see, and even it's not a desire, we see many Christians getting together to form communities that don't necessarily look like old monasticism, but are, if you really think about it, are a monasticism but rebranded.
Yeah, I guess I would say that probably started with the Anabaptists, and I think it's helpful to think of a lot of Protestant denominations as really just flavors that have always existed in the church, and that they didn't have their own name and they weren't their own denomination per se, but the theological strains of thought that eventually became these different branches were all within the one church. Even today in the Roman church, you have traditionalists, you have the Franciscans, you have the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and they have different flavors theologically and their praxis. They're different. And if there another Reformation happened in the Roman Church today, you could easily see any one of those groups becoming their own denomination as well. Voltaire famously said that the Reformation was boiled down to a dispute between two monks, and referring to the Augustinians and the Dominicans. That was a big root of the problem. Luther was famously part of the Augustinians, which, interestingly enough, our new pope is also from the Augustinian order and is interestingly talking about more ecumenical reform. But the thing is like these monastic groups were very tribal, and so when you get to the Reformation, there was a large impetus in a certain sector of Christianity to still maintain that attitude of poverty, getting away from immorality, getting away from materialism, having things in common. And the Anabaptists really kind of spearheaded that branch of the Reformation was really focused on that. Obviously you have branches of the Reformation, the magisterial reformers, they were focused on, basically appealing to the kings to protect the true church from the corruptions of the papacy and the abuses of the papacy. But the Anabaptists were less concerned with that and more concerned with going their own way in what you might call a living monasticism. And the Hutterites, are a good example. I mean, the Amish, obviously, and the Mennonites do this to some extent, but the Hutterites, they were much more strict about having things in common, oftentimes living in a compound together, having common agriculture, and eventually in the 20th century, the Bruderhof broke off of that, and they're also even more strong on that. And they're very monastic in that sense, right? They will have like a common factory that all the men work in. They raise their children together. They do these sorts of things, and yet they're not Roman Catholic. Interestingly enough, they tend to hold the seven sacraments and hold to the feast days, even though you when you think of reformers, you think of people that tend to move away from that. But you can still see the flavor and the echoes of the past, even in their traditions, And so you see the Anabaptists really kind of starting this. So when you get into the 20th and 21st century, a lot of the communal movements that you see originate in Anabaptists or Anabaptist breakoffs. And then, of course, with the Back to the Land movement with the hippies, you see like a secular desire to create communities with common ownership. Obviously, it's a bastardization of Christianity. It's a false Christianity, these hippie movements, peace, love, and this stuff that they promote, but they're also degenerates. So a lot of Christians...
It's like a pagan monastery.
Yeah, kind of. Right. And it's like Antichrist monastery because they're stealing Christian concepts and then rebranding them in a secular pagan light, which is, of course, how the devil works. He likes to counterfeit and corrupt that which is good and true. It's part of his way of deceiving people, But a lot of Christians now, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They see the problems with inflation, property costs, housing costs. They see the temptation of consumerism. They see how it undermines living traditional values. And they see how the treasures of this world cannot really satisfy and want to store up treasures in heaven. They want to work with their hands. But then when they go out into the field, they see there's very little options for them, right? It's like, okay, I either have to join like the Bruderhof or a Mennonite, but they'll make me become one of them, right? I have to become an Anabaptist to join their group in full standing. Or I have to go join a hippie community that's degenerate. And so these options have been very frustrating for a lot of Christians. Now you have the Alleluia community, which is kind of like a charismatic Catholic, it's like a mashup of like Pentecostals and Catholics. Several of our Supreme Court justices have been involved in that community. Amy Coney Barrett specifically was in the Alleluia community, which has, I believe, its headquarters in Georgia. And they actually started with a common ownership model at one time. So there are Christians outside of like that whole Anabaptist or liberal spectrum who are trying to do this. Homestead Heritage out of Waco, Texas is working on this, and have been very successful. There's an Anglican community, Christ Covenant in Vermont, I think is doing a very good job. And now we have various flavors of community. Not all of them are doing things in the monastic way in terms of common ownership. Some of them are still relying on private property and a more like, I would say, normie approach to the world in terms of material things. But the impulse is there. All these Christians are realizing that we have to have fellowship, we have to be in community with each other, we have to have each other's back, because the institutions are no longer trustworthy, they're no longer aligned with our values, so they pose a threat to us. I think the Reconstruction movement with like Rushdoony and Bonson and those guys that really spearheaded the rise of homeschooling really started making Christians think in terms of worldview. For a long time, it was kind of taken for granted that all of our institutions, because so many Christians were involved in them, were Christian in and of themselves, but they really weren't. They may have been influenced by Christianity, and there may have been Christians involved in them, but because they were secular enough based on the Enlightenment thinking that was behind them, they were more easily captured by secularists in the 20th century. And with Roe v. Wade and with the removal of prayer and Bible reading in the schools, Christians were kind of left flat-footed, where we're like, okay, now what do we do? And so Christians had the right impulse to pull out of those institutions, and many of them, as they see the same corruption extending to their food supply or extending to the medical system, have even pulled out further, not just in homeschooling, but in homesteading. But the problem is that they end up being isolated and alone and even further marginalized. And so families suffer burnout because it's a lot of work to try to go from, you live in a suburb, living a materialistic life, thinking that, Star Trek is our future and we're just going to go to college and everything's going to be all right. And then you go try to live out in the woods off grid and homeschooling a bunch of kids. It's
epic
too hard.
fail.
Exactly. It's too hard. It's too difficult. And so now Christians are like, wait, I like this, the idea that we raise our kids in a biblical worldview, right? I like the idea that we can provide for ourselves, so we have that security that these institutions who don't share a worldview can't like crush us. But I just can't do it by myself. And so now they're looking at, okay, well, can we get Christians together to do this? And so I think that impulse is gravitating towards a new monasticism, regardless of whether the people would use that term or even recognize that's what's going on.
Yeah, sure. That's a great way to put it. So you're the founder of Christian Exodus Project and the starter of the Jesus Village community. Can you kind of share the goal behind the Christian Exodus Project, why you started it, and how that led to the establishment of the Jesus Village?
Yeah, so I started the Christian Exodus Project, a couple years ago, just as a website. We had a lot of things I was just discussing, we experienced ourselves. I was seminary educated, I was pursuing academia, kind of ran headlong into cancel culture, decided to go into homesteading for my family's sake. I've been blessed with a wife, and we've had 9 children. One of them's with the Lord. And I feel like at the time, it was a rational decision to do that. It made a lot of sense given our worldview and given the situation in the world and what I had experienced. But we suffered this burnout and lack of community, especially in rural areas where, since the Protestant churches didn't hold the line on like a historic position on contraception, and a lot of the industrialization in rural areas had gone away, A lot of young people were just not there, either because their parents didn't have enough children, or the children that were there either got hooked on drugs or left the area completely. So a lot of churches are just a handful of old people. So we don't have a lot of community, and then we're alone busting our butt with no help, right? And so feeling this burnout and feeling this like in our own lives, we created the website with the idea of bringing Christians together to form a new monasticism where we could share the cost of buying property, building our houses, and also sharing the workload of farming, homeschooling, etc. And we always wanted it to be a church-operated community under the authority of, the apostolic authority, right? Under the authority of ministers, under the authority of the Word of God, not just some parachurch, independent, go off like a cult and start, we didn't want that for sure. And so we started the project mostly just as a blog, putting articles out there. But when I posted on Permies, which is a permaculture website, dedicated to homesteading and, sustainable agriculture, then we started getting a lot of attention. And so even though I'm the founder of the Christian Exodus Project, I wouldn't consider myself the founder of the Jesus Village Project, because really the Jesus Village Project was the culmination of a group of us who really formed our core group, 6 or 7 of us, who, we got together through Permies mostly and through talks and really started to be invested in this. And pretty soon we had a potential investor. He was putting millions of dollars on the table. He paid for all of our trips. In the last year alone, I traveled from, Seattle to Austin, from, across from Wyoming to Pennsylvania, from Arkansas to Pennsylvania. I visited a community in Arkansas. I've been in Dominica. We visited property in Tennessee. We've been visiting property in Oklahoma, and all supported and funded by these people who were interested in pushing this project forward. And there's just a lot of Christians out there who they're feeling the same thing. They see the same desire. They want to return to a robust, traditional, patriarchal, biblical Christianity, that's rooted in the historic faith. And obviously, there's Roman Catholicism, there's Eastern Orthodoxy, and these groups, and of course the Amish, but these groups are exclusionary. They're institutionalists. They're like, we're the only church, we're the only Christians. But most Christians who have, walked in this world for any time know that those churches are not the ones that have a monopoly on believers. And myself having been in the Baptist, Reformed, Lutheran, and Anglican communions, I've met true believers in all those churches, just as I've met pew warmers who weren't really believers. And there is a mystery there with wheat and tares, but, I think we know our own by the Holy Spirit to some degree. I think the Pentecostals have a point on that, and when you go to these traditions, you do meet real Christians in all of them. And a lot of them have the same instinct. A lot of them are getting into homesteading. A lot of them are getting into homeschooling. And that's why Permies was such a miraculous move for us. We never realized we would get so much response because so many of these like hardcore Christians were there studying how to live off the land and get out of the system, this Babylonian system, as the Rastafari would describe it. They are maybe from Lutheranism, they may be from the Assemblies of God, they may be from these different traditions, but they all have the same impulse that we need to go back to our roots, and in order to do that, we have to share the cost and we have to be willing to sacrifice for one another.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm sure that a lot of our audience can understand and even find some agreement with being in the church and running into conflict and running into those who are in the denomination, but then aren't really holding to the truths of the biblical teaching, even of the denomination, but are kind of going the way of the world. And I think there are a lot of our listeners, think really today there's a cry for Christian community and for Christians to come together. You talked about Jesus Village. How is the community life of Jesus Village structured?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do with the Jesus Village Project, and we're currently looking at a large property in Oklahoma, and so far everything's still on schedule for us to possibly break ground as early as this year, if the Lord so wills for that to happen. And the structure of it is a balanced model. So we recognize the concerns for people who, they want to have their own deed, they want to have their own property, but we also see the importance of the church running the community and there being a common ownership element. So I would start with saying that the structure is designed that everybody would have their own lot in a village setting. So we're modeling it after the medieval village, which was typically built around monasteries, especially when I was describing Celtic monasticism. This was the model, as was the Benedictine model, right? The monastery, the church was the center of the village. It was the source of instruction, of medicine, of teaching, and then around it, the people lived around in community. And, we see this, like, the benefit of living in a city is that you can walk everywhere, your neighbors are all next to you. There's an advantage to that convenience, but the rural life is nice because you have wide open spaces, you can live off the land. The village model of medieval Europe had the best of both of these, right? You're like a stone throw from all of your neighbors. You can walk to each other's houses. You can be in each other's lives. You're not isolated. But also you have a commons, right? You have tons of land that's held in common for agricultural use. So our model would be to have individual lots in the village. Everybody has their house and their lot. And we have the rest of the acreage, the hundreds and hundreds of other acres are communal agricultural land. So the work that's done in the community on the agricultural land feeds everybody in that village. And likewise, all of the utilities would be provided by the church. The church owns the utilities essentially, the solar, the water, all of that. And obviously there's benefits to this in protecting the church because someone who's excommunicated or removed from the community, from the church, so to speak, even if they own their own land, like they no longer have right of access to those utilities nor to the produce produced on the commons. Same thing if they refuse to work, right? Let those who don't work not eat, which I would argue in that text is in keeping with the idea of common ownership, right? The reason the church could say that, why Paul could say that, is that they were probably living like the church in Jerusalem to some degree in a lot of these churches where if they weren't working, right, they could actually have their distribution cut off to them, And so I would argue, and if you read like early church fathers, like, if you read Ambrose, if you read Chrysostom, they're basically complaining that that model that was done by the apostles was not pursued further into church history. So the idea that Christians live more monastically, not just a celibate, but all of us, was something that the church has always tried to push us towards. C.S. Lewis argued that if true Christianity was actually practiced, that it would get a lot of flack from the right and the left, even in his own era in Britain, because in some ways the left would like it. This is his characterization of it because, they're living in common, they have common ownership, they're against consumerism and materialism. But he also said the left would hate it because they would be promoting patriarchal values, hierarchy, women submitting to their husbands, things of that sort. And I think that even C.S. Lewis, right, an Anglican writing in the 20th century, acknowledges that if we were to follow the scriptures, you would have a monastic lifestyle where materialism is rejected, common ownership is promoted, but yet the patriarchal conservative values of God's law are also still practiced. They're not contrary to each other like Marxism teaches, but they're actually complementary, and unlike Marxism, which enforces it top down through the state, the common ownership practiced by Christians is done voluntarily in a spirit of love for one another. And so that's the general structure of the Jesus Village. As far as leadership, we would have two tiers. Obviously, like St. Basil insisted upon in his reform of monasticism, the community has to be under the authority of the church. So if you have duly ordained ministers, right, that's like the first branch of governance. The duly ordained ministers have primary authority over all matters pertaining to law and gospel and word and sacrament ministry. And I would include in that, being judges in matters of criminal offense, which would lead to excommunication or expulsion from the village. But you also have head of households, right? So even in a monastery, all the monks do have some say over certain tasks in their life. Yes, they're subject to the abbot and to the bishop, but they do have authority over the menial tasks to which they're assigned. And in our community, we would have head of households. This is how we also can merge multiple Protestant denominations together. Because though the elders are willing to accommodate household differences, every household declares their distinctive. So if you have a Baptist or a Lutheran or a Presbyterian, their sacramental convictions, as an example, like credo baptism versus pedo baptism, would be respected by the elders, accommodated by the elders, and they are making that decision for their family before God. So the liability before God for Okay, are they sinning by not baptizing their kids or by baptizing them? Well, they as a father over their family will have to answer to God for that, and we as the elders are merely accommodating them to facilitate unity. And we got to see that this is the early church model. St. Basil, who was St. Basil the Great, he was one of the Nicene fathers. So, he sat at the Council of Nicaea. If you read his work on the Holy Spirit, he was basically a Baptist. He didn't believe you should be baptized until after you showed evidence of conversion. And yet St. Augustine, who was a contemporary, right? They overlap in time. He was a bishop as well. St. Augustine was a paedocommunionist. If you read his sermons, he believed that infants can partake of communion, and he obviously believed in infant baptism. Now, both of those men today would not be ordained in the respective so-called churches that claim them, right? So the Roman Church would not ordain St. Augustine because of his position on paedocommunion, and the Eastern Church wouldn't ordain St. Basil, even though they do his liturgy several times a year, because he was basically a Baptist, and yet they could both be bishops in the same church, So when we talk about one Catholic Church, one Catholic faith, we need to promote what the church always believed about that, which is that, yes, on the essentials there must be unity, right? But on the non-essentials there is diversity, right? And in all things charity. And I think that is the model that the early church had, and that's the model we would have for the village. So that's our structure. The ministers are the primary authority, but the head of households have authority on all areas not pertaining directly to the ministry. So where a road goes, how the house is done, as well as their own personal household convictions, all of that is determined by the head of households, either in themselves or as a group.
Yeah, so there's a balance between the heads of households and the session, the elders, and I like it that you brought up Augustine and Basil, because I actually talked about that in my last podcast, where yes, Augustine believed in infant baptism, even infant communion, but Basil did not, and still they were still part of the same church, and I think that's wonderful how seeing Jesus Village as a return to that, and a return to Christians being united in that way. So would the members of Jesus Village be able to work outside of the community? How would that work?
Well, I think for various reasons, some people will have their own businesses before they come in. They may already have a career. We are obviously very open to that, and people can work outside the community. Now, if they're not able to participate in the work of the community, then they would have to pay for those things that the community provides. So the community is providing all of their off-grid utilities, and obviously there's going to be communal food that's, sustainably raised and grown. If they're not participating in that work, then they would have to pay for it, whereas those who participate in the work to make those things would receive them for free. We also have a work exchange, so that if you don't have a lot of money, you're a young family, you come in, you help build houses, you can get your house and lot for free. Especially with the housing crisis, a big reason a lot of Christians can't pursue traditional living where the wife stays home and they have kids is because of the cost of real estate and the cost of housing. So yes, we would encourage people to be able to go all in and just live in the community and work in the community. We're not going to bar people from working outside the community, but if they do, they have to keep in mind that if they're not able to help grow the stuff, then they have to pay for the stuff. And of course, all of that money would go to supporting the church and supporting the community at large.
I think that's pretty interesting, unique, that people would be able to be a part of the community and still retain their jobs outside, as long as they're helping out with and supporting the work that's going on in the community through their money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's important only because it's going to be a transition for everybody. That's why we have a mixed model to begin with, where you own your own house and lot, you have your own deed, but also everything else is, owned through and by the church in common with everybody. You can balance those two models, right? Throughout history, there's been attempts to reconcile, even politically, what would be considered like the left, right, with like a more of a Marxist approach of, governance versus like a more, libertarian or right wing. And that's why you have what's called the third way or third way politics. Among Catholics, it was the Catholic land movement or distributism, but also obviously we know fascism and other right-wing policies have tried to integrate these two extremes, right, into one, but also, apart from Christ and the Christian worldview, you really can't do that. And even the Catholic land movement had its own flaws and was never really able to get off the ground more than having drinking parties with G.K. Chesterton, which, though being completely badass and have been awesome to be there, that it didn't really move the needle politically for Christians, just other than putting out some good ideas for people to ponder. And that's why it has to be grassroots. It has to be Christians that do this. In America, we have such a tradition of having our own land, having rights over our land to some degree. It's hard to convince people to take that risk and lose everything by joining a community. And so this kind of gives it the balance. The community is protected from the people who join. They can't just join, become completely apostate and degenerate and still, be able to live scot-free in the community, because we can cut off their power, we can cut off their water, we can do that all legally, and they can be cut off from not only all the fellowship and all of the things that we do as a community, but they can also be cut off from the communal food. That pressure, along with, basically being barred from communion and no one talking to you as you're shunned, that would be enough pressure for most people just to leave voluntarily. I mean, obviously they could hold up in their own house and buy their own power and collect rainwater, I guess, and live as a hermit, but 90% of people aren't ever going to do that. So, but that's how we've been able to strike that balance, And another thing I would like to add that I didn't mention earlier is that we also accommodate different worship styles in a unique way by offering multiple worship services. One of the big things that divides Christians is the way that worship is done. I'm in the Anglican communion now. I was in the Lutheran church. I was in the Reformed church as well. But in the Lutheran and Anglican churches, they have a liturgy following the Western Rite, the traditional Western Rite, actually. People don't realize this, but the Anglicans and Lutherans, their worship is actually more traditional than the Vatican II worship, in the way they do the altar and the way they do the liturgy. But liturgical worship is very important to people who practice it. But at the same time, like especially with the Reformed who hold a more regulative view of worship, it's very slimmed down. They removed all those elements of the liturgy that they believed were not expressly laid down in the New Testament, whereas the liturgists argued that only those things which contradict the scriptures should be removed, what's called the normative principle. And instead of using these things as like a grounds to perpetuate division, we accommodate those who come in. So we can have a worship style that is the more slimmed down, Reformed style worship, but we can also have a liturgical worship as the High Church has always practiced. And so you can go to these different services, and we would encourage everyone who joins to go to all the services. Eventually we'll probably have a contemporary evening service, even maybe like on a Friday night. And I would encourage all believers to, I would say, worship the Lord on every occasion. Family worship is very much slimmed down compared to a full mass that you would have like on a Sunday morning in an Anglican church, but it's still worship. You're still going before the Lord in prayer and singing psalms and studying the Word of God. And so these services, even if they're not liturgical, right, they're still worshiping God. They're still celebrating the triune God. And our requirement is only that members go to at least one service and commune with us there, as well as to go to one of our studies. But we're going to have multiple studies. We're going to have multiple services, and we're only going to facilitate unity through dialogue. And so only by going to each other's services, discussing them afterwards, going to studies together and fellowshipping, is there ever going to be any progress made to like a full unity. This Jesus Village omni-denominational model is just the first step. I don't claim that it's the be-all, end-all. The goal would be eventual uniformity in the sense that though there may be some diversity in beliefs, we do have a common worship. We do have a common doctrine in all matters. But that is never going to start until there's dialogue and fellowship. The reason a lot of these traditions can't even communicate with each other anymore is because they've become insulated from each other. Lutheran theology, Reformed theology, they've developed as separate branches for so long that they've forgotten how much they actually have in common and their common origins. And we have to get back to that. But it's just like with a family member or a friend. You're less likely to convince somebody, a stranger, of your position or your beliefs by going up to the stranger, telling them they're wrong, and getting into an argument. You're far more likely to convince somebody by first having a relationship with them, by first having communion with them. Once you have that relationship, then that dialogue can lead to changes either direction. And that's the whole point, right? We have to, if we are all believers, truly believers, One body partakes of one loaf. We have to be united on these essentials first, and then on these non-essentials, we can work it out over time.
I mean, sure, yeah, sure. That would be the point of getting into a monastic community, is that you're united on the essentials, and that you see the way the world is going, and that you want to live in fellowship with Christians that are like-minded and are not going to live in the way the world is living.
Absolutely.
So we talked about how Jesus Village is structured. We talked about different kinds, allowing for different kinds of worship, the heads of households and the session, and even giving giving the certain decisions to the heads of households. What's your vision for Jesus Village in the next 20 years?
Well, and I also want to touch on this idea that we're promoting a new monasticism real quick. And the idea that we're a new monasticism, I think, is true, right? So we're not new in the sense that we're innovating in the area of religion, which all Christians should be skeptical of. We're going back to the original vision of monasticism that we see in Acts 2, right? We see in the Church of Jerusalem. These weren't all just celibate people, right? These were people that had all things in common, but they were families. They were married couples, and oftentimes with children. And when you see the church fathers saying that this should be the model for everybody, it was not thought of in the early church that monasticism was something for the celibate, and then basically everybody else has to just be part of the regular material world. No, the early church, in fact, one of the things that the church fathers even said was that basically if everybody had pursued the structure of life that was laid out by the apostles in the Church of Jerusalem, that the gospel would have already triumphed over the world by now. So the early church fathers really did believe that if we had followed this apostolic model, we would have done more to advance the gospel and preach it, because that's also been a criticism of monasticism, right? That it's insular, it's not sufficiently evangelistic, it's like a cloister, right? That's the idea of a cloister, right? That you're kind of cut off. But that's not it at all, right? In fact, one of our members talks about something called dominion missions. You see guys who are missionaries, they go out on their own. Like you take a family, right, a husband and wife and 2 kids, and you send them to Saudi Arabia to get killed or burn out. And they have to go and pour mouth and beg every church for funds in order to support them, right? But if you were able to do this and this is also how the Celtic monastics did it, because they planted in Europe, in continental Europe, from the islands. They would just do break-offs, right? So it wasn't like I'm just sending an individual out. I'm sending like a cluster of families to then plant a new community in a new land to do evangelism, but not just to do evangelism, right? You preach the gospel to somebody and then you leave them there. That's why a lot of Africa descended back into barbarism and savagery, because there was no discipleship, but that discipleship works better in community, right? Bearing one another's burdens. You can't do that by yourself. You have to have other people's burdens in order to bear them, right? You can't weep with those who weep unless you're with people that are weeping, and so by transplanting community, like once a community gets so big, you take a chunk of it and then you transplant it somewhere else, you're actually being a better witness, because now you're transporting the very incubator of the Christian life, which is fellowship with other believers. And then also that community now is more equipped to teach, feed, train, even for things as mundane as agriculture. All of those things now can be taught as a community to that local population that you're evangelizing. And so when you look at
church planting, basically.
Yeah, it's a new model for church planting as far as contemporarily, but it's really not a new model. And that goes back to what you were saying. This isn't a new monasticism. This is actually an old monasticism. This was the pattern laid forth in Scripture. This was the desire of the church fathers. And this was the actual practice model of the Celtic church, right? Before it was reintegrated back into the Roman model, where the monastic system was already established and clerical celibacy was already being pushed hard. So this model is reinvigorating the old system and the desire of the fathers and the desire of the Scriptures. And so as far as that is concerned, the Jesus Village absolutely is a new monasticism. And to go to your last question that you just asked me about the vision is to create an alternate system, right? The institutions that we're in right now, I already described them as Babylonian. They are arrayed against the Christian faith. They don't assume the Christian worldview, whether it's the medical system, whether it's the public education system, the military, the state. They all assume a worldview contrary to Christianity. The secular worldview isn't the lack of a worldview, it's an alternative worldview. It's a worldview that has a different theory of creation, a different theory of providence, a different theory of human nature, a different anthropology. These things are all completely different than what the scriptures teach. And yet these institutions have so much power over the lives of individual believers. So the vision is really for us to create our own society again. This happened after the fall of Rome. When Rome fell, the Benedictines, they realized hey, people, peasantry, they are now broken away from the institutions that are now gone, right? Rome's gone. How are we going to bring back education? How are we going to bring back agriculture and a strong economy? It's only going to be by Christians taking the lead and forming these communities where we can train the local people. And so the idea of doing a Jesus Village is to look ahead and say, look, we're facing a fall of Rome type moment. This isn't something to be afraid of, right? We've seen many empires come and go, right? And the church continues, right? There was a promise made by Christ that, he would establish his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And this truth motivates us to realize that, yes, these earthly kingdoms, right, as Augustine says, the city of man, these kingdoms come and go, right? The Habsburgs with the Holy Roman Empire, the actual Roman Empire, whatever empire you can conceive of, they have all fallen. But the church remains. And we should not be so arrogant to think that the United States is going to be here as it is right now forever. And we've already seen a lot of evidence, and anyone who has studied the path and pattern of civilizations can see these evidences. We're seeing evidence that the American system, the neoliberal global order, is showing these marks of age, right? They're showing these marks of decay and decline and possibly eventual collapse. We may have a respite right now under Trump. To me, it should be all the more motivation to work harder and really make a run for it. But the signs are there, right? Whether it's low birth rates, whether it's immigration, whether it's, lack of trust in institutions, lack of patriotism, whatever it might be, right? These signs do not bode well for the secular order, but the church will be fine. The church will continue. But just as the church reacted to decline in the past, we need to react to it now, which is forming our own communities. First of all, for our own security, to provide for ourselves in the event that these institutions do fall, right? Once the welfare is not there, once the economy is no longer reliable, what are people going to do to feed themselves? Well, we'll be there to do that. When the schools are gone, who's going to educate our children? Well, we will. So we are doing the things that the early church did with the monastic system to assist the facilitating of a new Christendom. So if you want to know what the vision of the Jesus Village really is, it's building the building blocks of a new Christendom. Does it mean it's going to look like the old Christendom? Not necessarily. I think that there was a lot of flaws with the old Christendom. I think it was too obsessed with hierarchical powers, the government structures, monarchies, empire building, conquest. We were too caught up in a lot of things like that as a civilization, where we acted like the world, right? Whereas what Christ wants us to be is the first shall be last, the last shall be first, as he says, right, among the Gentiles, right, they have kings over captains and captains over, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing, but not so with you, right? So my hope is that the Jesus Village will set a pattern that for the next Christendom, we won't make the same mistakes as the old Christendom that eventually led us to secularism, but we have to start small. We have to know that, one person sows and another reaps. We may never see the full fruit of what we're doing, but maybe our children will. Maybe they'll grow up where all the girls are getting married young as virgins, staying in their marriage for 70 years and having, a dozen kids. This was how it was for thousands of years, and we can restore that. Yes, this first generation is broken, but this first generation knows it's broken and is willing to go out on a limb as pioneers to get this started. And we're doing it for the future, for this new Christendom. It's as Martin Luther said, he said, even if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I'd still plant a tree today, and that has to be our heart. We have to have the heart that what we're working towards right now, it will benefit our children and our children's children, and that's worth all of it.
Well, thank you for having on, and thank you for coming on and for sharing about the Jesus Village. And we look forward to hearing more and seeing more what God is doing in the Jesus Village and also in other monastic communities around the world.
Thank you.
Next time on the Reformed Catholic Podcast. We will discuss 5 ways in which the modern church is like the Roman Catholic Church. Until then, may God bless you and keep you in the faith.